Enterprise radar picked it up at 10:12 a.m. The operator stared at the sweep. Too many signals, merging into one pale bruise. God, they're all coming here. The bridge smelled of coffee gone sour and hot varnish. Outside, the Philippine Sea lay flat and metallic, sunlight scattered like shrapnel. On the plotting table, grease pencils scratched circles and arrows. Bearings west-northwest, altitude climbing, speed steady. The ship's wake whispered against steel like someone shushing a crowded room. Down in CIC, the radar man tapped the glass with a fingernail, once, twice, hoping the blur would separate into numbers. 300 no, 400 contacts. This is not a malfunction. He didn't realize he'd stood until the chair hit the bulkhead. On the flight deck, the air reeked of gasoline and salt. Crewmen crouched by the chocks, waiting for the flagman's arm to fall. Black aces scramble. Repeat, scramble. The loudspeaker barked, then the klaxon, 2 beats too long, like a heart that missed. Engines screamed awake, props spun white. Pilots ran low under wings, faces blank, movements precise. One man kissed 2 knuckles and tapped the fuselage. Another touched his wedding band before climbing in. Their Hellcats waited in rows, thick-bodied and patient, paint scarred at the wing roots where boots had carved a path. The deck officer's flag slashed down. The first fighter tore loose, wheels up, roaring into sky. Then another. The carrier became a machine that exhaled fire and steel. Below, the chaplain closed his prayer book and slid it into a pocket already warm from use. Far across the sea, Admiral Ozawa stood on his bridge, confident in what he called the Empire's great air shield. 400 planes, Zeros, Judas, Kates, rising from Japanese decks in perfect order. He believed the gods had arranged their wind. He didn't know yet about the American radars watching every heartbeat of his attack. Altitude 20,000. Vector 270. Contact in 2 minutes. The controller's voice was cold water. The young pilots answered with clipped calm, hands steady on throttles. They had trained for this geometry. Trust the instruments, not the fear. The ocean below was only rumor. At 10:36, they saw them, a line of dots, then more behind, until the horizon itself seemed to crawl. Tally-ho, someone said, and the fight began. The Americans rolled on their backs and dropped like knives. The first tracers cut the sky, thin orange threads in the sunlight, and the neat formation ahead broke apart like glass. Radios burst alive. Splash 1, 2, left 9 o'clock. Another voice cracked, laughing too hard. They're not even turning. The smell of burned oil and cordite followed the wind. In CIC, the radar man finally took his hand off the glass. The smear was no longer a smear, it was raining echoes. He caught himself smiling, then remembered he was 19. On Japanese decks beyond the curve of sea, crews shaded their eyes, waiting for shapes to return. The chocks were ready, stretchers too. A petty officer held a cigarette and didn't light it. The horizon stayed empty. Break, break, more bogeys high. Another voice jagged through static. The second wave climbed into a sky that felt solid. From below, the fleet looked like punctuation marks on a page of blue. Commas of destroyers, the dash of a cruiser, the bold sentence of an aircraft carrier. Every ship listened. Even the gulls stopped calling. There were cheers when a bomber flamed out, smoke curling like a banner. Then silence. The crowd feeling, that unseen third presence, tightened across the decks. A mechanic, hands black with oil, muttered, "They're walking into it." He didn't mean courage or foolishness. He meant math. The controller's last message rode the air flat and final. First wave engaged. Heavy contact. Repeat, heavy. The words left no space for imagination. When the sky over the Philippine Sea finally exploded, no one yet knew this would be the largest air battle and the greatest slaughter in human history. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Jim McKee said later, "They came straight at us. No evasive move, no cover. I pressed the trigger and watched them fall, one after another. It didn't feel like a fight. It felt like gravity chose sides." By mid-morning, the Philippine sky was streaked with black trails that twisted and vanished before reaching the sea. The battle spread wide, invisible to those on the decks except for the faint echoes of engines and the scattered dots that winked like stars at noon. Radio waves carried fragments of voices, quick and flat. Fox 1. Splash. Next target. The sound of killing without emotion. The Hellcats had the advantage in everything that mattered: speed, armor, altitude, training. They'd flown together for months, drilled on simulators that taught them to shoot without thinking. The Japanese pilots were new. Many had less than 100 hours of flight time. They could take off, turn, and land, but not fight in 3 dimensions. Their formation discipline broke at the first flash of tracer fire. Some climbed when they should have dove. Others turned directly into gunfire, as if obedience could stop bullets. McKee's squadron came in high, sun behind them. He saw the first Zero open fire too early. The tracers fell short like sparks from a dying fire. McKee pushed the stick forward, closed distance, and squeezed. The Japanese fighter seemed to pause midair, then peeled into smoke, wing folding like paper. He didn't cheer. He just climbed again, searching for another target, his mind empty but his body electric. Down on Enterprise, men crowded the edges of the deck, watching through binoculars. They couldn't see faces, only specks moving in geometry too fast to follow. The carrier shuddered each time its own planes launched another wave, catapults hissing, the smell of burned rubber and hot oil coating the wind. Someone in the gunnery crew muttered, "Hell, it's a damn shooting gallery." The phrase caught, passed from mouth to mouth, until even the officers were saying it. The Marianas turkey shoot, born in real time, cruel and too easy. At 11:20 a.m., the first wave was nearly gone. Radios reported no opposition, which wasn't true. The opposition was dying too fast to count. Japanese bombers tried diving through the flak curtain. Some reached within sight of the carriers before evaporating under combined fire. Fragments of aluminum and flesh rained into the sea, leaving slicks that shone like oil rainbows. A deckhand would later write, "The sky darkened, not from clouds, but from debris." Inside a Hellcat cockpit, everything was vibration, gunfire rattling teeth, the canopy smeared with oil. The smell of cordite and sweat filled the pilot's mask. One bullet cracked the glass near McKee's shoulder. A splinter of plexiglass nicked his neck, warm blood mixing with the metallic taste of adrenaline. He didn't notice until later. He banked hard right, saw 2 Zeros chasing his wingman. A short burst, one vanished, the other spun down like a falling leaf. Over the radio, someone laughed and shouted, "That's number 9 for me." Another voice, calm and southern, "Save your ammo, kid." At noon, the radar screens showed the sky clearing, not from victory, but absence. The swarm had thinned to echoes. Controllers recalculated vectors for stragglers, guiding new groups of interceptors toward the remnants. Each order was a death sentence delivered in calm tones. Bearing 280, Angels 10, 2 bogeys. And somewhere in that blue emptiness, 2 more young men died. By the time the sun tilted west, more than 200 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. The sea was quiet again except for the distant thunder of engines returning home. American pilots landed one by one, some with holes in their wings, one with half a tail, one missing his radio antenna entirely. Deck crews ran forward, counting bullet scars, not bodies. McKee climbed out stiffly, sweat freezing on his back. "You all right?" someone asked. He nodded. He wasn't sure. In the ready room, the survivors drank water that tasted of tin and adrenaline. Someone pinned a map to the wall and marked kills with grease pencil X's until there was no more room. The laughter that followed was hollow, a sound to fill silence. Outside, mechanics refueled, patched, wiped blood off metal as if cleaning a kitchen counter. Far across the horizon, on the Japanese carrier Junyo, an officer tried to tally who hadn't returned. Out of nearly 400 launched that morning, barely a handful checked in. Radio calls went unanswered. The flight deck crews stared at the empty sky. No one spoke. The admiral's staff still reported moderate success. Numbers can lie if you write them hard enough. As dusk approached, the air cooled and the ocean turned to copper. The surviving Hellcats flew in, sunlight flashing on bullet holes like jewelry. On deck, men pointed and whispered. Some planes missing half their markings, some landing gear jammed halfway down. Yet almost all returned. The contrast was obscene. One side nearly untouched, the other erased. McKee sat on a crate, helmet still on, eyes unfocused. Someone passed him a cigarette. He didn't light it. The smell of burnt oil clung to everything: skin, fabric, air. In the logbook, he wrote just one line before sleep took him upright. They never had a chance. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Admiral Ozawa was still waiting for reports that would never come. Static hissed in his headphones, the kind of silence that feels alive. When the final echoes faded from the radar screens, no one on Enterprise celebrated. They'd won a battle so one-sided it felt wrong to name it victory. But the ocean wasn't finished yet. Tomorrow would bring a new signal, and something burning beneath the surface. The flagship Taiho cut through the morning glare like a blade too bright to touch. On its bridge, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa held his binoculars steady, scanning a horizon that refused to answer him. His uniform was spotless, white, pressed, absurdly calm. Beneath the deck, the ship vibrated with heat and trapped fumes. Someone opened a hatch for air, and a gust of gasoline rolled through the corridors like breath from a furnace. "Where are our planes?" he asked, softly at first, then louder. "They should be returning by now." No one met his eyes. The radio crackled with distant bursts of static, a sound like paper tearing underwater. One voice, thin with distortion, said something about enemy losses heavy, then faded into noise. Another claimed success over multiple carriers. The words didn't match the silence outside. Down in the hangar bay, fuel hoses lay like veins across the deck, still slick from refueling the morning's strike. Mechanics sat among the fumes, shirts unbuttoned, wiping sweat from their necks. Somewhere, a cook dropped a metal tray, and everyone flinched. The air smelled not of war, but of something waiting to ignite. At 2:30 p.m., a distant vibration shivered through the hull, not loud, just wrong. A muffled thump, then another, like doors slamming deep underwater. The ship listed slightly, just enough to make the lights swing. Men looked at one another. Then came the message from below. Torpedo hit, port side. Minor flooding. The word minor calmed no one. The torpedo, dropped from an American submarine hours earlier, had struck just aft of the forward elevator. The explosion ruptured fuel lines, and vapor began to seep invisibly through the ventilation ducts. The fans, still running to keep the hangar cool, spread the poison evenly. Ozawa was told the damage was contained. He nodded once, trusting the calm voice of an engineer who hadn't yet smelled the change in the air. A breeze passed across the bridge, faint, sweet, metallic. No one spoke of it. On the lower decks, a petty officer lit a cigarette. He took 2 drags before another man slapped it from his hand. The spark hit the oily floor, died, then flared again. The blast tore through the hangar like a single enormous breath. The ship convulsed. Elevator doors bulged. Fire rushed upward through shafts, through ducts, through men. A jet of flame ripped across the flight deck, catching a line of aircraft still loaded with bombs. The first detonation was bright enough to erase shadows. From the bridge, Ozawa watched the blast crawl toward him, a rolling orange tide. His cap blew off. Alarm screamed. The Taiho, pride of the Imperial Navy, began to burn from the inside out. "Evacuate the hangar," someone shouted into the intercom, but the line was already dead. The admiral gripped the railing. Around him, the officers' white uniforms turned gray with smoke. He could hear the ocean outside, distant and indifferent. The crew fought the fire with hoses and sandbags, but the deck plates were too hot to stand on. Steam rolled in waves, peeling paint from bulkheads. The ventilation system, the same one meant to clear the air, now carried the fire into places no hose could reach. Fuel tanks beneath the second deck began to rupture in sequence, each explosion closer, duller, heavier. Ozawa refused to leave the bridge. He ordered the communications officer to transfer command to another carrier, Zuikaku. "Send my regards to His Majesty," he said, voice steady, though every surface around him trembled. At 3:45, the flagship listed 10 degrees. Lifeboats were cut loose, some never hit the water. The ocean around the ship glimmered with burning oil. Sailors jumped, their bodies small against the scale of the wreck. The fire made its own wind, bending smoke flat against the sea. A young ensign, clothes scorched, found the admiral still on the bridge, staring through a broken window. "Sir, we must abandon ship." Ozawa turned slightly. His face was gray with ash, his eyes unreadable. "Do you hear it?" he asked. The ensign hesitated. "Hear what, sir?" The sea, Ozawa said. It doesn't sound the same anymore. Minutes later, the Taiho's deck erupted. One final internal blast, massive enough to lift the bow clear of the water. The ship split, folded, and began to slide under. Those who survived the jump watched her go silently, the white hull fading into the dark. The admiral was rescued hours later by a destroyer that followed black smoke to the site. He climbed aboard without speaking, water dripping from his sleeves. Behind him, the last bubbles of the Taiho surfaced and burst like sighs. Night came quickly. The surviving Japanese ships flickered on the horizon, reduced to silhouettes. The fleet had lost its nerve, its air cover, and its voice. Messages went unanswered, coordinates vanished mid-sentence. On Enterprise, far across the water, the men gathered by the railings, watching columns of smoke in the distance. No one cheered. They didn't yet know which ship was burning, only that something immense was dying out there. By midnight, the ocean was quiet again, too quiet. The radios carried no more enemy chatter, just the low hiss of the atmosphere. When the admiral finally removed his headphones, the silence seemed heavier than the sound. He had commanded a fleet that no longer existed. And somewhere in that darkness, a single question kept echoing through his mind. If no one is left to hear you, are you still in command? At 5 p.m., the ocean glowed like a furnace door left open. Wreckage burned in the troughs, fuel floated in long slicks that rolled with the swell, and among the drifting debris, bodies turned slowly in the light. The message from the American fleet came through the static, plain and unadorned. The sky is ours. Flight quarters again. On the carriers, the wind stiffened with speed, deck crews trotting through the heat that made the paint smell sweet. Hellcats rolled forward as escorts, Avengers lined up like patient hounds, Helldivers crouched with bombs beneath their wings. The flag dropped, and the first plane clawed into the light. They climbed through brown smoke until the air turned blue again, then spread wide, long fingers combing the western horizon. They found the enemy by their wakes, white scars cutting through copper water. First destroyers, small and fast. Then cruisers, black guns tilted skyward, throwing bursts that bloomed like dirty flowers. Beyond them, the carriers, rectangles of shadow dragging smoke. One tall and proud, another half-hidden, flame crawling along its deck. Names didn't matter yet. To the pilots, they were only targets. Strike leader to all sections. Descend through 8,000 feet, torpedoes first. The Avengers nosed down into the heat, through air that smelled of salt and burning oil. Tracers stitched upward, thin and bright, flak bursts rocked their wings. A pilot held steady, breath locked, eyes fixed on the churn beside the ship's stern. He released, the torpedo dropping clean, tumbling once before vanishing into the sea. He pulled up hard through smoke that scraped the canopy like sandpaper. He looked back just in time to see the strike hit home, a bloom of orange where the ship's flank used to be. Over the radio, a calm voice confirmed, "Good hits, good hits." Elsewhere, a Helldiver dove nearly vertical, the world a blur of gray. The pilot counted heartbeats to steady his hand, released at the edge of reason, then pulled until blood fogged his vision. When color returned, he saw the explosion climbing, black smoke thick as tar. "Direct," his gunner murmured. On the carrier Shokaku, the first torpedoes ripped open the hull beneath her armor. The ship lurched, then sagged. Fuel ignited in the hangars, and flame rolled through her decks. A single transmission escaped into the ether. "We can no longer hold." It didn't sound like surrender, only truth. Another carrier, Hyo, tried to flee downwind, dragging a column of smoke that reached for miles. Avengers skimmed the waves behind her, their engines shaking the air. One pilot whispered to his machine, "Steady now, steady." His torpedo struck amidships. The side of the ship bulged, folded, and tore open. Fire poured from the wound. Men jumped. Some didn't come up again. McKee, back in the air though no one had told him to fly, remembered the color more than the sound. The sea turned black with oil, the glare stamped across it like a broken sun, and within that glare, the movement of arms, legs, life refusing to die. "We could still see them moving down there," he said later. He never forgot that line. On Enterprise, planes returned with paint blistered from heat, holes like scars along the fuselage. One Hellcat taxied in trailing smoke. A crew chief slapped the wing with a rag, leaving a black handprint. The pilot climbed out smiling too wide, then sat on the wing and shook until the grin cracked into sobs. No one spoke. Across the horizon, Japanese gunners kept firing at ghosts. A destroyer, half lost in smoke, loosed shells in desperate rhythm. On a burning deck, men dragged hoses through flame, faces masked in soot. A pilot trapped in his cockpit hammered at the canopy until blood covered the glass. Two crewmen pried it open and carried him out while the soles of their shoes melted. For a moment, everything went quiet, the strange pause between an explosion and the shockwave that follows. Then the air slammed back. A section of flight deck lifted like a door and fell again, taking men with it. When it landed, fire rose once more. By sunset, the strike groups were low on fuel and turning home. Controllers on the carriers traced returning call signs with grease pencils. The wind had cooled, carrying the sour sweetness of burning ships. Pilots landed long and hard, cables clanging, planes swaying like drunks. They climbed out without words. Reports came in clipped sentences. 2 carriers destroyed, another burning, cruisers crippled, destroyers scattered. The maps filled with excess. Someone whispered, "This isn't just victory. It's a new kind of war." Radar had chosen the meeting, fighters owned the sky, and the sea had lost its authority. Night rose out of the east like smoke reversing itself. Fires still burned on the horizon, pulsing red beneath the clouds, the dying heartbeat of a fleet. A pilot leaned on the rail, watching the glow fade, and thought of that earlier message, "The sky is ours." It sounded too small for what he saw. Later, on one open frequency, a Japanese voice broke through the static. Just one word, repeated twice, softer the second time. No one could agree on what it said. Later, they decided it didn't matter. By full dark, the ocean lay still, except for the faint crackle of wrecks burning themselves out. Signal lamps winked across the fleet. The air smelled of salt and hot metal cooling. Men tried to sleep. Some did. Others lay awake, counting the distance between flashes. At midnight, new orders came down. Bearings, distances, a pursuit west into the dark. The admirals wanted a chase, and the pilots would give it to them, if the fuel would carry. The sky had turned red that evening, but by morning, the ocean would begin to speak. Morning came thin and colorless, a lid of metal laid over the Philippine Sea. No smoke, no thunder, only oil slicks curling like handwriting and the quiet drift of wreckage. A radioman aboard Lexington wrote in his log, "No enemy aircraft sighted today." The words looked too clean for a place still full of ghosts. By late afternoon, new orders crossed the decks. Admiral Spruance wanted pursuit. Ozawa was retreating west with what remained of his fleet, a scattered, bleeding thing. The Americans could finish it, but the range was cruel. More than 200 miles, daylight fading fast. The brief was plain. Strike at dusk. Return in darkness. If you can't find the fleet, land on the water. We'll come for you. No one asked how. In the ready rooms, the air smelled of sweat and pencil shavings. Pilots sat still, heads tilted toward the voice on the intercom. The risk was arithmetic. Fuel enough for one attack, maybe. If they missed, they'd die on the way home. But no one hesitated. One pilot closed his flight manual and said quietly, "Guess we'll test the maps tonight." At 6 p.m., the decks thundered. Engines spun up like angry prayers. Hellcats rose first, then Avengers heavy with torpedoes, then Helldivers with their bombs clamped tight. The air had cooled. The horizon looked bruised. One by one, the planes clawed into it, wheels folding like fists. The carriers emptied, their decks suddenly too quiet, too wide. From the air, the ocean was an endless sheet of pewter, the sun bleeding out of it. Formation lights blinked in pairs, tiny constellations born of men. They flew west by compass and faith, the sea below swallowing color. The radios were mostly breathing, the calm voices of controllers far behind. Maintain Angels 10, check fuel. Keep heading. They found the enemy as daylight died, small shapes crawling through smoke. Torches on water. The Avengers descended first, slow and steady, torpedoes falling like silver commas into the dark. Flak climbed after them, red blossoms that burst and faded. A pilot muttered, "They're shooting blind," and went lower still. He released. climbed, turned once, and saw fire spread across a ship's bow like a second sunset. Helldivers followed, diving through smoke so thick the instruments lied. The horizon vanished. Only instinct and color guided them. One dropped too late, another too soon. But enough hit. A Japanese carrier took a bomb aft. Another shuddered under a torpedo strike. Over the radio, a voice said flatly, "Good hits. Let's go home." No one cheered. The way back was darker than anyone imagined. The ocean had no edge, no shape. The stars above felt close, but useless. Fuel gauges trembled, near empty. The fleet was somewhere east, spread wide and blacked out. The only promise was a code repeated every few minutes. If you can't find us, steer 90 degrees. Destroyers will burn lights. The pilots whispered it like prayer. One formation drifted south, chasing a false coastline of clouds. Another climbed, trying to catch a radio beacon that wasn't strong enough. McKee kept his wingtip on the faint blur of exhaust from his leader. One mistake, and he'd lose him. He counted his heartbeats instead of miles. Then, suddenly, a miracle. White columns stabbing up from the horizon. Searchlights, steady and sure. Flares arced from destroyers, lighting the sea in trembling gold. Men in cockpits blinked hard, unsure if it was real. "I see them," someone said. Turning in. The air crackled with call signs and relief. Landings came wild and fast. Planes dropped onto black decks barely visible in the light of signal wands. One helldiver slammed down so hard its tail collapsed, but the crew walked away. Another missed the wires and vanished overboard. Just flame, then dark. A radio man whispered names as each pilot checked in, erasing those who didn't. Others never saw the lights. A lone Avenger pilot called, "Fuel gone, altitude 500, then silence. Somewhere, water closed over him with a small sound. A destroyer swung toward the splash, men already throwing ropes into the dark. They found nothing but floating metal. By midnight, the surviving planes had returned, the lucky ones. The decks smelled of oil and fear cooling into exhaustion. Mechanics rolled dead engines away. Medics counted burns, not victories. A chaplain stood under a lamp, crossing out names he'd hoped to keep. Far to the west, the horizon still glowed faintly red. The Japanese fleet, what was left of it, burned without shape or voice. The sea rocked gently, as if trying to hush everyone. A pilot who had ditched and been pulled from the water sat wrapped in a blanket, watching sunrise crawl across the waves. He said nothing for a long time, then murmured, "We won, didn't we?" No one answered. When morning finally came, the light showed everything: oil, splinters, rafts, and men both living and still. The victors and the dead drifted together in the same calm sea. Tokyo learned the truth in pieces, as if the radios were ashamed to carry it whole. Numbers arrived first, stripped of adjectives. Of roughly 430 aircraft launched, fewer than 100 found any deck to land on. The rest were smoke, oil, and names. Staff officers recopied the figures by hand, as if a different pen might change them. It did not. In a quiet room inside the Naval General Staff, the air smelled of ink and wintergreen from the paste-on maps. When the doors closed, men stopped pretending to be loud. Admiral Toyota stood with his hands behind his back and listened to his subordinates recite what they knew. He did not interrupt. When they finished, he said, "We no longer control the air." He did not raise his voice. Someone coughed into a sleeve and could not stop. A courier carried a brief to the palace. The paper was thin enough to show the writing on the other side. The characters bled when folded. The question that came back was not dramatic. "Is it accurate?" Toyota's answer was also simple. "Yes, Your Majesty. We have lost the sea." The words slipped into history with no ceremony at all. On bases across the home islands, pilots returned to empty ready rooms. Lockers were opened and found to hold nothing but spare gloves. A duty officer, out of habit, posted the next day's flight schedule. No one tore it down. In one corner, a young man gathered the chalkboards and washed them carefully until the black shone. He left the erasers in a neat stack and went outside to smoke with both hands shaking. At Truk and Tinian and Saipan, the Empire's map shrank without argument. American carriers rolled east to west like weather fronts, bringing their own skies with them. The path to the Philippines opened. Leyte, Luzon, lines on a chart that would become graves. On destroyers and transports, U.S. Marines cleaned weapons to the rhythm of the engines and wrote short letters home. We're moving again. The ocean seemed to be leaning toward Japan like a long decision. In Japanese wardrooms, officers burned old charts. Medals went into drawers, or into pockets, or across a table into a son's hands with instructions to pawn them for rice, if it came to that. A commander removed his white gloves and found line marks where the cloth had disciplined his fingers. The skin beneath was soft, almost civilian. He wasn't sure what to do with that. The analysis from the American side was efficient and merciless. Staff reports used the phrase decisive engagement and meant it. Radar had made surprise a ghost. Training and armor had turned youth into a weapon. Logistics had out-argued bravery. After the Marianas, we knew the end had entered the room. A U.S. veteran would say years later. But it was going to make us sit and listen. Somewhere in a Tokyo barracks, a captain gave a different kind of briefing. He spoke quietly about winds and spirit, about steel guided by will rather than orders. He described tactics that did not require return trips. Men looked at their hands and imagined them holding blossoms. The word was not official yet, but it was walking toward them across the floor. Taco. Special attack. Kamikaze. The silence that followed the Marianas was not peace. It was pressure. Factories hammered at night under blacked-out skylights, turning out aircraft faster than schools could make pilots. Manuals were shortened. Training flights clipped. Young men read poems they barely understood and signed forms that looked more like vows. In mess halls, toast grew shorter. In cities, mothers folded white headbands with a care usually reserved for firstborn clothes. The fleet that had once called itself the Empire's Sky Army existed now as a rumor scattered among islands and piers. A few carriers limped north, their decks warped, their elevators frozen in place like broken teeth. Destroyers ran with their lights masked and their radios shy. They were not a shield anymore. At best, they were a gesture. In an underground communications room, a clerk filed the last comprehensive roster of aircrew attached to Ozawa's command. He stamped it, as regulations required, and placed it on a shelf beside binders that would never be opened again. When the shift ended, he went outside and watched the clouds for a long time without naming their shapes. American headlines called it a turning point. The phrase fit neatly in columns and felt good in the mouth. At sea, the men who had done the turning stared at the railings and tried to decide how much of what they felt was pride and how much was something colder. They cleaned their guns and changed their socks and sent radar operators to sleep, and nobody used the word final even once. After the Marianas, the sky over Japan emptied. It was not safety. It was a stage. In the new quiet, a different sound began to gather. Thin at first, like wind under a door, then stronger, a note you feel in your teeth before you hear it. What came next would not be a strategy so much as a scream. At 5 in the morning, the sea was flat and gray, rippling only where oil streaked the waves. Captain Frank Brown stood on the bridge of his destroyer, scanning the water through binoculars. The dawn light caught something pale between the swells, a jagged piece of metal, the curve of a wing. He focused until he saw it clearly, a torn section of fuselage, the word Hellcat still visible. His stomach dropped. "That's Danny's," he said quietly. No one replied. The crew already knew. The rescue began before sunrise. Dozens of pilots were missing after the night raid. Men who had run out of fuel, ditched in darkness, or simply vanished into the sea. The destroyers fanned out in search lines, slow and deliberate. Engines hummed low, radar screens swept in patient circles. Every few minutes someone shouted from the deck, pointing at debris, a life raft, an oxygen mask, a glove floating palm up like a signal. Most of the time, there was no one attached. Air Search 1 to Fleet Control. We see wreckage, possibly survivors. The radio operator leaned forward, hope burning behind his eyes. A pause, then another voice. We see a parachute, moving. Might be alive. Cheers broke out, short and surprised. But the next transmission never came. Just static, then silence. By mid-morning, the ocean had turned silver and cruel. Brown's ship pulled a raft aboard, empty except for a bloodied headset and a torn flight jacket. One sailor folded the jacket carefully, as if it were sacred. Another whispered, "At least we found him." Nobody corrected him. Farther north, a Catalina search plane droned low, circling in widening spirals. The crew marked each sighting on the window with a grease pencil. Debris, empty raft, flare, gone. Once they saw movement, a man waving from the water, but when they turned, only bubbles remained. Over the radio came fragments of desperation. Possible survivor. Correction, negative. God help him. The heat rose as the day wore on. Sunlight hammered the sea flat, erasing the horizon. Men squinted until their eyes watered. Every piece of wreckage looked like a body. "We're chasing ghosts," the navigator murmured. Brown didn't answer. He just kept scanning the water, moving his binoculars inch by inch, the way a man might read a long list of names. On the carriers, victory had begun to taste hollow. The decks were quiet, the air thick with fatigue. Pilots who had survived the night stood at the railings, faces blank, staring down into the same sea that had taken their friends. One of them said, "We own the sky now, but look what it cost." In Enterprise's ready room, a chalkboard still listed call signs. Names were crossed out, rewritten, crossed out again. The commander came in without his cap, eyes sunken. "We won't celebrate," he said. "Not until we count the living." He left before anyone could answer. By afternoon, the fleet's engines slowed. The rescue teams had pulled in little more than fragments. Radios crackled with fatigue, returning to base. No further contacts. The ocean shimmered with the wrecks of both sides, now indistinguishable, Japanese, American, all broken the same way. That evening, Brown stood on deck as the last rays of sun turned the sea red. He thought about Danny, his grin, his constant humming, the photo of his wife tucked inside the cockpit. Brown took off his cap and held it against his chest. "You made it higher than any of us," he whispered. The waves rolled on, answering with their steady hush. As darkness fell, the searchlights came on again, thin white fingers slicing across the black water. Every few minutes, a flare went up, lighting the sea gold for a heartbeat before the dark swallowed it. "Rescue 2, do you read? Possible light ahead." "Static." "Say again." "Nothing." The operator's hand trembled as he repeated the call. Around midnight, one of the destroyers found a man tangled in parachute lines. His skin was blistered from salt, his lips cracked. When they hauled him aboard, he whispered the same thing over and over. "He was right beside me." Later, when he could finally speak, he asked if Danny had made it. No one answered him either. By dawn, the search was called off. The crews were exhausted, the fuel was gone. The decks filled with silence and the smell of diesel. Sailors washed the salt from their faces, folded flags, and stood at the rails as if still looking. A medic counted the rescued, then stopped, unable to continue. The logbooks would later list the results neatly. 42 recovered, 30 missing, presumed lost. But no words fit the sound of the sea that morning, flat, calm, and final. Brown leaned against the railing as the first light spread across the water. The horizon glowed faintly pink, beautiful and terrible. Somewhere out there, Danny was part of it now, not gone, just changed into something the ocean would not return. They had won the sky, but many who helped win it would never come back to see it again. This victory had been paid for in blood, and what it did to the men on the other side, that was only beginning. In the Imperial Navy headquarters, the air was too still for summer. Dust floated between the lamps like smoke that had forgotten its fire. No one spoke. Charts covered the long table, seas, islands, red and blue pins marking what used to be front lines. Admiral Toyota stood at the far end, hands clasped behind his back, staring at the map without seeing it. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost kind. "We have not lost our planes," he said quietly. "We have lost our faith." The officers didn't look at one another. The floor creaked as one of them shifted his weight. Reports lay stacked in trembling piles. The last transmissions from Ozawa's fleet, each one shorter than the one before. Aircraft destroyed. Fleet scattered. No further contact. Of 400 planes launched into the Philippine Sea, fewer than 100 returned. Many of those were too damaged to fly again. The best pilots, the veterans who had survived Midway and Coral Sea, were gone. The hangars that had once hummed with skill were now filled with silence and boys. A staff officer began to read the numbers aloud, but his voice faltered halfway through. Toyota raised a hand. "Enough," he said. "We know the total." Someone lit a cigarette just to fill the air with something living. The The smoke coiled up and vanished near the ceiling fan that no longer turned. Later that night, in a smaller room, two young officers spoke in whispers. "If we cannot win by strength," one said, "then we must win by spirit." The other stared at the floor. "Spirit won't stop bombs." "No," the first replied, "but it can guide them." Their words spread quickly through the wreckage of the command structure, a new kind of logic for a nation that had run out of choices. The newspapers still printed victories, but the men in uniform had begun to use other words: honor, sacrifice, purity. The empire had lost its armor of machines, and in its place was building a shield of belief. In the following weeks, small meetings were held behind closed doors. They talked of TACO, special attack units. The idea was not born in madness, but in despair made tidy, shaped into strategy. The reasoning was simple. If a plane and a pilot could sink a ship by dying together, perhaps death itself could be weaponized. To men raised in a culture that revered duty over life, it didn't sound insane. It sounded inevitable. The first documents were written by hand. Thin paper, brush ink, stamped with red seals still wet when folded. They called it the divine wind, kamikaze. The phrase came from an old story, a storm that had once saved Japan from invaders. Now it was meant to save the soul of the nation. Orders followed. Identify volunteers, train them quickly, teach them to aim. There was no lesson for returning. One surviving pilot from the Marianas campaign was summoned to a new base south of Tokyo. He was 21, with burns still fresh on his arms. He limped into the office, saluted, and waited. The commander looked at him as if measuring something invisible. "You have seen defeat," he said. "That makes you ready." The young man didn't understand at first, but the paper he was handed left no room for confusion. His name would be among the first. In the mess halls, rumor replaced food. Men whispered about units where no one came back, about ceremonies with white headbands and flowers. They told each other it was an honor. Some believed it, some didn't. A mechanic was heard saying, "We build wings now not for flying, but for dying." He was reassigned the next day. Tokyo's nights grew darker as the lights dimmed to save fuel. Trains ran late, filled with young men staring out at a city already beginning to look like a memory. In temples, priests blessed photographs instead of people. Mothers folded headbands for sons who had not yet been chosen. One evening, a letter from Ozawa himself arrived at the Naval Staff Office. The handwriting was steady, almost gentle. "We fought as the gods demanded. But even gods grow silent. Tell them to remember the sky as it was, full of wings." The note ended with his signature and nothing else. When Toyota read it, he closed the folder and stood at the window for a long time. Outside, the city pulsed faintly with blackout lights, a heartbeat muffled by war. He said to no one in particular, "This is what happens when pride becomes hunger." The men around him began drafting new orders, not for fleets or squadrons, but for individuals who would fly alone. Their pens scratched softly, like insects on glass. Every stroke made the world smaller. No one yet understood what those orders meant. Not the officers who wrote them, not the pilots who would follow them. But in the quiet that settled after the Marianas, something irreversible had taken root. And months later, when the first of those young men steered his plane into the side of an American ship, the sound that came after the explosion wasn't shock, it was recognition. They had finally found a way to fight without expecting to come home. Years later, one of the Hellcat pilots, gray-haired now, his hands still trembling when the engines of passing planes echoed overhead, was asked how it felt to win. He looked past the camera, toward some invisible horizon, and said, "We didn't celebrate. We just watched the ocean." Everyone knew the war wasn't over. In June 1944, the Philippine Sea had been both grave and revelation. The numbers became legend. Japan lost 346 aircraft, the United States 30. Ratios that looked clean on paper, too clean to hold what the sea had taken. The Americans had claimed the sky, yes, but what remained afterward was not triumph, it was quiet. On Enterprise, days after the battle, the decks still smelled of smoke and paint scorched by sun. Mechanics moved slowly, cleaning oil from rivets, patching bullet holes already streaked with rust. Pilots wandered the catwalks like men between worlds. They talked in fragments, about engines, about the heat, about who hadn't come back, and then stopped mid-sentence, as if words had grown too heavy. The radio rooms hummed softly with peacetime voices for the first time. Test signals, weather reports, logistics. No enemy chatter. The silence felt unearned. A radio man wrote in his log, "The air is ours now." Then, after a moment, he added, "But it's strange how empty it sounds." Across the Pacific, the Japanese mainland also fell silent. No engines took off from its runways. Hangars stood open to the wind, their floors glittering with shattered glass. The surviving officers walked through them like men visiting a cemetery. In one diary found after the war, a pilot had written only one line before his final mission: "We will rise once more, even if it is only to fall." For the Americans, the victory at the Marianas marked a new age, an empire of air, of distance made small by engines and metal. Yet none of them felt immortal. They knew what waited ahead. Leyte, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, islands whose names would become synonyms for hell. The pilots who flew over the Philippine Sea would fly again, some to see Japan burning below, some never to see anything again. A historian once called the battle the beginning of the end. The pilots who fought it preferred to call it the day the sky changed. After June 1944, the Pacific no longer belonged to the sea. It belonged to altitude, to radar screens and aluminum wings, to bombs falling faster than prayer. The ocean was no longer the judge of men. It was just the mirror of what the sky decided. On a warm evening aboard Lexington, the survivors gathered near the bow. Someone played a slow tune on a harmonica, off-key but steady. The sun dipped low, washing the deck in gold. A pilot named McKee leaned against the railing, watching the waves slide past. "We made it through," he said. Another man beside him answered, "For now." They didn't speak again. Below deck, an empty bunk still held a folded photograph and a letter never mailed. A chaplain paused there, closed the curtain gently, and whispered a name into the air, not to be heard, just to be said. He would do that for each of the missing. By the time the fleet turned home, the smoke columns from the destroyed carriers had faded into the clouds. What had been a battlefield was now only weather. The ocean erased its own scars with a kind of weary mercy. The men standing on deck didn't cheer. They just watched the horizon and let the wind touch their faces. Back in the States, newspapers printed headlines in bold: "Great victory in the Marianas. Enemy air arm destroyed." Crowds cheered, but the men who had been there knew the cost behind those letters. Each statistic carried a name, a voice, a face reflected for an instant in the water before disappearing. Years later, McKee visited a museum where his old Hellcat sat polished and silent under glass. The paint gleamed too brightly, the cockpit spotless. He leaned close to the canopy and saw his reflection where his friends had once been. For a long time he stood there, hand resting on the cool metal, listening to a silence that felt exactly like that morning after the battle. The Marianas victory had ended Japan's air power, but it had also begun something darker, a shift in the war's soul. The Americans had proved mastery of the sky. The Japanese, stripped of theirs, had turned to death as a weapon. Both nations had crossed a line they could never recross. When interviewers asked the old pilot what it meant, he would smile sadly. "It meant we could go anywhere we wanted," he said, "and no one could stop us." That's what winning felt like. Then, after a pause, "But when I think of the ones who didn't come back, I wonder if maybe we all stayed up there a little too long." The Pacific lay calm beneath the museum windows that day, sunlight winking off the water. It looked harmless again, almost gentle. McKee thought of how it had looked that morning in 1944, full of wreckage and flame, and felt something close to gratitude that the sea could forget what men had done to it. He stepped outside and watched a jet tear a white line across the blue sky. The sound arrived a heartbeat later, thin and distant. He smiled once, not in pride, but in understanding. On June 19, 1944, America had conquered the sky, and in the quiet sky that followed, another thought had begun, one that still hadn't gone away. Maybe no one ever truly wins a war.